In the summer of 1940, with an enemy army gathering just across the Channel, one man's words became a weapon. Great Britain was the final big European power fighting the Nazis. Its army was in tatters, its ally France was collapsing, and a full-scale invasion felt not just possible, but imminent. This was Britain's darkest hour. And in that moment, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons to deliver a speech that would echo through history. But what was the reality behind the rhetoric? How do you tell your country it's on the brink of destruction, while also convincing everyone that victory is still possible? This is the story of how words were forged into a shield, a sword, and a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. The spring of 1940 was a catastrophe for the Allies. After the quiet of the phony war, Hitler unleashed the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, on Western Europe. On May 10th, German forces stormed into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg with terrifying speed. It was the very same day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, inheriting a war effort that was already spiraling into chaos. The Allies expected the main German attack to come through the heavily fortified Maginot Line. They were wrong. Instead, German panzer groups, including multiple armored corps, smashed through the dense Ardennes forest, a region everyone thought was impassable for tanks. They burst into France at Sedan on May 13th, a move that completely outflanked the best of the Allied armies, including the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, which had moved into Belgium to meet the first invasion. The German tanks didn't stop. They raced for the English Channel in a giant sickle cut, slicing the Allied armies in the north off from their supply lines. By May 21st, the Germans had reached the coast, trapping the BEF, what was left of the Belgian army, and 3 French armies in a shrinking pocket. The situation was dire. The entire root and core and brain of the British Army, as Churchill would later call it, was cornered with its back to the sea. When the Belgian army surrendered on May 28th, it exposed the Allies' flank and made a desperate situation even worse. The BEF's commander, Lord Gort, saw what was happening. Amid the chaos of collapsing defenses, he made a crucial decision without waiting for orders. He began pulling his forces back toward the one port still in their hands, a small coastal town that would soon become famous for both disaster and deliverance, Dunkirk. The Allied strategy was in ruins. France, the great power meant to anchor the Western Front, was being broken. Britain now stood nearly alone, facing an enemy that had conquered most of Western Europe in just a few weeks. The stage was set for a desperate gamble to save an entire army from annihilation. What happened at Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th is remembered as a miracle. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, it was one of the most desperate rescue missions in history. Facing constant attack from the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, the Royal Navy sailed into a storm of bombs and shells. They were joined by a ragtag flotilla of hundreds of civilian boats, fishing trawlers, yachts, and ferries, the legendary little ships, all there to pull soldiers off the beaches. It was a brutal, chaotic ordeal. The main harbor was quickly bombed into wreckage, forcing troops to wade out from the beaches into the sea, forming long, exposed lines as they waited for rescue. Under a constant rain of bombs, the rescuers made trip after trip. The courage shown was immense. Even hospital ships, clearly marked with the Red Cross, were hit in the chaos of the air attacks, yet their crews never wavered. When the operation finally ended, the numbers were staggering. Against all odds, 338,226 Allied soldiers, including over 120,000 French troops, had been snatched from the beaches and brought to Britain. A wave of euphoria swept the nation. The boys were home. Newspapers hailed the miracle of deliverance. But Churchill saw something else. He knew this public celebration was dangerously misplaced, and that a heroic retreat is still a retreat. His main goal on June 4th, as he prepared to speak to Parliament, was to shatter this illusion. Britain had just suffered, in his own words, a colossal military disaster. The BEF was saved, yes, but it was an army without its weapons. It had left behind nearly all of its heavy equipment in France, thousands of vehicles, and over 2,500 heavy guns. Britain had its soldiers back, but they lacked the tools to fight a modern war. The island was now virtually defenseless. While the public celebrated a miracle, Churchill knew the truth. Wars are not won by evacuations. The danger hadn't passed. It was now closer than ever. Winston Churchill was hardly a popular choice for prime minister. He'd only taken office on May 10th, replacing Neville Chamberlain, whose policy of appeasing Hitler had so obviously failed. For years, Churchill had been a lonely voice in politics, warning about the Nazis to a country that didn't want to listen. Now he was in charge, but his position was shaky. Many in his own Conservative Party still saw him as a reckless warmonger and remained loyal to Chamberlain. As the disaster in France unfolded, Churchill faced huge pressure from inside his own war cabinet. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, a powerful and respected figure, argued that Britain had to explore a negotiated peace with Hitler using Mussolini's Italy to broker a deal. His logic was cold and pragmatic. France was beaten, the army was trapped, and a distasteful deal was better than the complete destruction of the nation. For a moment, the fate of the war hung in the balance, decided not on a battlefield, but in the tense, smoke-filled rooms of Whitehall. Churchill's resolve was absolute. He argued that any peace with Hitler would make Britain a slave state, helpless before a dictator who couldn't be trusted. To settle the matter, he did something unusual. He convened his wider 25-member outer cabinet. He told them, "I have thought carefully in these last days whether it was my duty to consider negotiating with that man. If this island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The ministers erupted in defiant support, giving Churchill the backing he needed to reject Halifax's proposal and commit Britain to fighting on, no matter what. So, as he stood to speak on June 4th, Churchill wasn't just a prime minister giving a report. He was a leader who had just won a political battle for his country's soul. He had to prepare the nation for invasion, justify his decision to reject peace, and send a clear message to the world, especially the neutral United States, that Britain would not break. This speech was his declaration. He had to lay out the brutal facts while lighting a fire of resistance that could never be put out. On the afternoon of June 4, 1940, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons. The speech he delivered wasn't just a single piece of soaring rhetoric, it was a strategic weapon aimed at several audiences at once. It was part military update, part political manifesto, and part epic call to arms. He didn't start with defiance. He started by laying out the cold, hard facts, recounting the fierce fighting, the Belgian surrender, and the mechanics of the evacuation. He was showing his command of the situation, building credibility. Then came the pivot. After detailing the rescue of over 330,000 men, he delivered the line that was the true point of the speech. "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." With those words, he burst the bubble of public euphoria. He acknowledged the bravery, but framed it as the consequence of a colossal military disaster. He needed the nation to shake off its complacency and get ready for the fight of its life. Having laid out the grim reality, he began to build the emotional core of the speech. He praised the Royal Air Force, saying it had inflicted heavy losses on the German Luftwaffe and proven its quality, a vital seed of hope. He addressed the threat of invasion head-on, reminding the room that when Napoleon was ready to invade a century earlier, he was warned, "There are bitter weeds in England." Churchill then added his own touch. "There are certainly a great many more of them since the British Expeditionary Force returned." It was a flash of dark humor, a way of saying Britain's soldiers had returned tougher than ever. Then came the ending that made the speech immortal. Here, Churchill's language became poetry, using repetition to create an unstoppable rhythm of determination. "We shall go on to the end," he began. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air." With each line, the promise grew, expanding the battlefield from a beach in France to the entire globe. Then he brought the fight home. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be," and the lines that followed became the ultimate vow of total resistance. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills." The genius here is its simplicity. It moves from the coast inward, turning every field and every street into a battleground and every citizen into a soldier. It's a statement of pure, unyielding will. He followed this crescendo with 2 words of ultimate defiance: "We shall never surrender." But he wasn't finished. The final part of the speech was aimed squarely at President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States. "And even if," Churchill said, "which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old." This was brilliant diplomacy. It was a clear signal to America that Britain's fleet would never fall into Hitler's hands. It was an assurance that the fight would go on from Canada, Australia, and the rest of the empire. It was a subtle invitation, declaring that Britain would hold the line, but that ultimate victory depended on the new world joining the struggle. The reaction inside the House of Commons was powerful. Many were moved to tears. One politician told Churchill, "That was worth 1,000 guns." For others, though, the grim reality of the message sunk in. The speech confirmed their worst fears, and no amount of inspiring words could erase the feeling of dread. The mood for some was not triumphant, but somber. Now, one of the biggest myths about this speech is that the entire country huddled around their radios that night to hear Churchill's voice. That's not what happened. Parliamentary rules at the time forbade live broadcasts. The public only heard a BBC News announcer read excerpts from it. The powerful recording we all know today wasn't made in 1940. Churchill recorded it in 1949 for history's sake. The "We shall fight on the beaches" speech didn't instantly transform public morale. Its power grew over time as its phrases were printed in newspapers and repeated on the radio. Government reports from the time suggest the speech's grave tone actually made some people more pessimistic, as the idea of fighting on alone was terrifying. It wasn't a magic wand. It was more like slow-acting medicine. It managed the nation's expectations, replacing a fragile optimism with a clear-eyed, grim resolve. The legend of the speech grew with every day that Britain survived, until it became the founding story of its defiance. If you're fascinated by how a single moment can change history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We break down the speeches and events that defined our world. And let us know in the comments, what other historical speech should we analyze next? Winston Churchill's speech on June 4, 1940, was a masterpiece of leadership. It was born from desperation, but delivered with defiance. It didn't promise an easy victory. It promised a brutal struggle, on the seas, in the air, on the beaches, and in the streets. Churchill's genius was his ability to stare into the face of a colossal military disaster and call the rescue a miracle, while warning his people not to celebrate. He balanced the terrifying reality of the present with an unshakable belief in the future. He used words not to hide the truth, but to make the truth bearable. The speech didn't sink any ships or shoot down any planes, but it armed the British people with something just as critical: the will to fight on. In Britain's darkest hour, its greatest weapon was the voice of one man, refusing to even consider surrender, and ensuring that this would indeed become their finest hour.